Good evening. I'm Graham Allison, and it's my great honor to welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum tonight General Anthony Zinni, who's here as the Corliss Lamont Lecturer this year. General Zinni rose through the ranks of the Marine Corps to earn 4 stars as Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Central Command. When he retired from the Marine Corps in 2000, Secretary of State Colin Powell chose him to be the U.S. Peace Envoy to the Middle East, a position he held until 2003. In 2004, he published a New York Times bestseller, co-authored with someone else named Tom Clancy, entitled Battle Ready. The youngest of 3 children, Tony Zinni worked his way through Villanova, where he was involved, where he signed up for a summer tour, I think, in the Marine Corps, and ultimately graduated as a 2nd lieutenant. As a Marine, he distinguished himself as one of our nation's most courageous warriors, serving 2 tours in Vietnam, earning a Bronze Star and a Purple Heart. In a lesser-known arena of military activity, emergency relief operations, from Operation Provide Comfort in northern Iraq to Operation Provide Hope in the Soviet Union, where I had a chance to work with them, and a number of similar operations in Somalia and Kenya. He's been a leader in actually crafting and executing a military function, which is to provide emergency relief under distressing circumstances. As CENTCOM, as it's called in the Defense Department, the Commander-in-Chief of Central Command, he was proconsul to an empire that stretched from the Horn of Africa to Afghanistan, including Iraq and Iran. And their leaders across that region turned to him from everything, for everything from civil wars to uprooting terrorism to relieving starvation. Over the course of his career, there have been many observations made about Anthony Zinni. One of the ones that I remember from a mutual friend, Colin Powell, was that you can always depend on Zinni to speak his mind bluntly. Okay? And he's done this to the discomfort of almost every institution with which he's been associated and with almost every person for whom he's worked. He's nicknamed the Godfather in the Marine Corps, where more than once, when invited to join fellow officers for an outing of golf, he observed that if it doesn't draw blood, it ain't a sport. About America's great victory in Desert Storm in 1991, of which he was one of the planners, where we kicked Saddam out of Kuwait, he said, quote, "The only reason Desert Storm worked was because we managed to go up against the only jerk on the planet who was actually stupid enough to confront us symmetrically with less of everything, including the moral right to do what he did to Kuwait." About Vietnam, he's even more scathing, and one of his favorite targets there is a sometime speaker here, former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, about whom he said, McNamara, quote, "decided that all the services should have a common combat boot. He decreed that to economize, there would be no half sizes, so that I had to wear size 10 instead of size 9.5, my regular size. My feet are still screwed up to this day, thanks to Robert Strange McNamara. And that just about symbolizes the leadership we had back then." About our current war in Iraq, General Zinni has also been quite outspoken. And I'll give you just 3 quotes, and then I'll stop. This is from his 60 Minutes appearance in May of this year, initially. He said, well, no, first from the book, Battle Ready with Clancy. He says, quote, "In the lead up to the Iraq War, I saw at a minimum true dereliction, negligence, and irresponsibility. At worst, lying, incompetence, and corruption. False rationales presented as a justification, a flawed strategy, lack of planning, the unnecessary alienation of our allies, the underestimation of the task, the necessary distraction from real threats, and the unbearable strain dumped on our overstretched military." In his 60 Minutes appearance in May, he said, quote, "There's been poor strategic thinking in this. There's been poor operational planning and execution on the ground. And when people say they're going to, quote, stay the course, I say the course is headed over Niagara Falls." And finally, he says, naming names, "I believe that Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz should accept responsibility for this performance. If I were commander of a military organization that delivered this kind of performance to the president, I would certainly tender my resignation." Close quote. So please join me in welcoming General Anthony Zinni tonight.
Thank you. I never mean to piss anybody off. And listening to that, it got me a little concerned. It just comes out. It's part of my my heritage, I guess. The topic tonight, as we were deciding on what to talk about, kind of got more narrow than I wanted it to be. It really talks about the Middle East, but I've come to the conclusion that part of the problem we have in this part of the world is maybe we're too narrow in our thinking or too compartmentalized. And I would like to broaden my remarks to the Islamic world and broaden it to an area that stretches from North Africa to the Philippines, from Russia down into Central Africa. Because I think at the beginning of this century, the greatest responsibility that's going to befall the world, that part of the world, and us and everyone else, is to manage to get through the turmoil, the upheaval, the confusion, the adjustment to modernity, or whatever that's going on in this very significant part of the world. I've spent the last 15 years in this part of the world, stretching from all the ends that I described. I have many friends in this part of the world, on all sides. I want to tell you up front that I'm not going to make any statements today that are politically motivated or take a side. Basically, what I want to do is give you what I would term an observation from the front, if you will. Some observations from someone that has been in this part of the world for the last 15 years. Hope that I understand something about this part of the world, and maybe some ideas or suggestions as to the way forward. Not just to the way forward for us, the United States, the West, the First World, whatever, but for all of us, because there are certainly responsibilities fall to the leadership in this part of the world, too. It's going to have to be a cooperative effort to get through it. One of the things that strikes me about the way we deal with this part of the world is our lack of understanding of the connectivity of events and issues out there. And this sort of hit home to me this past week when a good friend of mine, Pervez Musharraf, came to the White House. Clearly, from the president's point of view, from our point of view, the number one issue with Pervez had to deal with his ability to stay the course up into the hills in the Northwest Territory. I've been up there. It is the Wild West. And to keep his troops engaged hunting for Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. What interested me was Musharraf's number one priority in discussing with the president, and that was the need for the United States to engage in the Middle East peace process. Now, why does someone in Pakistan, with all the issues he has to face, India, his own internal problems, his economy, extremist movements, the situation in Afghanistan and the problems that presents to him, why does he bring as the number one consideration to the President of the United States the Middle East peace process and the need for us to engage and be committed to it. It points up, I think, it would be the theme of what I'm going to talk about tonight, and that's the connectivity of the issues that go on in this part of the world. Sometimes I believe that we are not even organized in the right way to deal with these. I believe State Department covers this part of the world in 4 or 5 different bureaus. The military covers it in 3 different unified commands. We don't even have a sort of a holistic view or a bureaucratic organizational approach to deal with this part of the world. So we're sort of fragmented just by organization and by the nature of the way we make policy to deal with this part of the world. There is no inherent, I think, part of that civilization and part of our civilization that make us natural adversaries. I don't subscribe to Samuel Huntington's theory, and I don't believe that there is something inherent in each civilization that is going to lead us to some sort of inevitable clash. But I do believe that we make mistakes, or we even have those that would like to see that happen, and it can be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we have to be careful that it doesn't become that way. This is not sort of a homogeneous part of the world, even though it shares a common religion, and that's the way I describe it. It is very diverse. It is extremely diverse. It is more diverse and it has more issues within itself than even they would like to believe or let on. But at the same time, they do have the connection, and the connection is primarily religious. But it leads to other connections. It leads to a sense of identity. I was recently at the University of Leicester in the United Kingdom, where I gave a talk, and I was talking to one of the professors there who happened to be a Pakistani, who was a British citizen, and we were talking about the Islamic community, the Muslim community in Leicester. It's been studied by a number of different people because and it's been the subject of articles in the New York Times and elsewhere, because it's been a remarkable community in that it hasn't had the problems that other communities in the United Kingdom have had. And they go through great lengths to try to prevent problems. The community works hard, even though it's a very diverse community again, to make sure that problems don't move to the point where there's friction between the races and ethnic groups. But when we were talking about some of the causes of the problem, he mentioned to me that the most significant problem that he thinks generates this is the way they are identified in the United Kingdom. And he said this is true of France and Germany and elsewhere. He came to the United Kingdom as a Pakistani who happened to be Muslim. And alongside of him in that same community is an African who happens to be Muslim, or an Arab who happens to be Muslim. They are categorized as the Islamic community or the Muslim community. They are forced into an identity by religion. They are forced to find common ground in the mosque. Their youth are forced to find common ground at the foot of some mullah whose motivations and whose preachings may not be the kind of thing the community writ large wants to hear or have happen. So the country itself, Europe itself, forces them into an identity that it doesn't necessarily need to have, nor do they necessarily want. My parents were immigrants to this country, and we settled in a small community in Philadelphia. And in my community were Irish, Polish, and Italians. We all happened to be Catholic. No one referred to us as the Catholic community. As a matter of fact, we had our separate churches, and we didn't deal much with each other, except on the block when there was a fist fight or something. But if we were forced into that position, if we had a religion that was seen as outside the norm, and that was our identity, and we cling to that for our identity, and we had clerics that used that, you can see the problems it might cause. In this part of the world, I think right now there are 10 significant issues that will mark whether it moves forward and actually adjusts to modernity, and that we get through the problems that we have, or if these issues are not handled in a way that will allow them to do that, we're going to have the friction that we will regret. And I'd like to run down each of what I consider the 10 most important issues in this part of the world and maybe make a comment or two about them. The first and I think most obvious is the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And as was mentioned by Graham, I was involved in this for almost 2 years. The peace process, whether it should be or shouldn't be, is the most significant core issue in this part of the world. It may be more emotional than it is substantial in terms of what it represents. There may be more significant problems that somebody could look more rationally and objectively into this part of the world and say that they should address than this. But whether it's Pervez Musharraf, or whether it's a Moro from Mindanao, or whether it's a Sudanese or anybody else, this will come back to be the central issue. It is, even if it is a matter of perception, the number one issue. It is the most important issue in the region in the minds of those that live in the region. It is the most important catalyst for change. What is important in their minds is that we, the United States, stay fully committed and engaged. They don't necessarily expect that we would solve the problem in the short term, but there's an honest belief that only we can mediate it, only we can bring the pressures on all sides, only we have the capacity and capability to see this very complex problem through to some sort of resolution that all sides can live with. This is probably the number one demand this part of the world would have on us. And this, I think, at this moment, is probably the last single thing that we can do to regain some sort of stature, image, sense of cooperation in the region that we have lost. Because right now, the view of us in this part of the world is at the lowest point it has ever been, and actually sinking lower, in my view. Now, we have been given an opportunity in the peace process, a tremendous opportunity, with the passing of Chairman Arafat and with the decision by Prime Minister Sharon to withdraw from Gaza. In my mind, these are two golden opportunities, but they will require extremely careful and deft diplomacy to work our way through. They will require the cooperation of Israel, the Palestinian leadership, the Quartet, United Nations, EU, Russians, the United States, and the full commitment of the Office of the President of the United States to try to resolve this problem, or to move the process forward at least, and to bring it to some sort of resolution. Gaza can be set up as a model state. It could be set up as the forerunner for what a Palestinian state can look like. It can demonstrate the ability of Palestinian leadership to govern, which hasn't been evident before. It can create stability and prosperity for a large number of Palestinians. And that model could serve well for the future of the West Bank and the Palestinian state. The new leadership, if it turns out through Palestinian elections, becomes Abu Mazen or Abu Allah, they are men, I think, that can negotiate to peace and are willing and desirous of getting to that state. I think it's going to be a long process, but I think it could be one that could demonstrate steady progress, and I think it can be one that would create hope if we engage. I would advise the United States to look back at what we've done in the past and not repeat things that didn't work. What didn't work? One thing that didn't work was the idea of special envoys. Special envoys that do touch and goes. This is not a process that lends itself to that kind of high visibility, high profile touch and go. The personalities become more confusing, more of an issue than what they provide on the ground. The personalities become magnets for media and press and other involvement. Personalities become too focused in and of themselves on the issue and end up becoming the lightning rod for the problem. I would hope that we put a number of highly professional, highly skilled diplomats that can work political, economic, security issues and other issues on the ground that are roll-up-your-sleeves kinds of people that can commit to the work, and leave the high profiles out of this process. The commitment of the Office of the President of the United States would be enough to give them the authority on the ground. I think the idea of sequentialism, too, is one that has passed its time. We have built a number of precursor plans out there. At the moment when we were at Camp David and Taba and elsewhere and talking about final status issues, we somehow regressed to Mitchell plans, Tenet plans, and even Zinni plans, which were mistakes, because these were all sort of precursor arrangements you had to complete before you moved to the next step. And we were actually moving backwards at the time by doing that. I think we're going to find that we have an opportunity to not only negotiate, but to actually implement at the same time, and the case in point being Gaza. And the case in point in working things out maybe one at a time, as opposed to some tremendous agreement that allows it to all happen at a single time. The Palestinian state may evolve instead of being created at a moment. I think we need to be careful in trying to in allowing ourselves to believe that the Palestinians would accept something where the sovereignty of the state is not defined. I don't think that'll work. The ideas of a Palestinian state without defined borders or other kinds of sovereign issues decided won't work, and I don't think they will accept that. They will see that as a poisoned apple. So this will take a lot of thought. This will take tremendous commitment. This will take a new approach, in my mind, in how to deal with it. But the opportunities are there. The second issue in this part of the world I'd like to talk about briefly is the global war on terrorism, the GWAT. First time I heard that term, I was at a study group sponsored by the Pentagon, and somebody kept talking about GWAT. Now, I know 15 seconds after you retire, all the acronyms in the military change, but I couldn't figure out what GWAT was. And they told me it is capital G-W-O-T, the Global War on Terrorism. What struck me as I thought about that term is we've declared war on a tactic. Terrorism is a tactic. Terrorism is the conduct of violent acts against innocents. It's a tactic. I asked those uniformed members around the table, what if we declare war on frontal attacks or river crossings or vertical envelopments? How would you feel about that? You know, and they kind of scratched their heads. I said, we just declared war on a tactic, which tells you something. It tells you about the confusion as to who we're fighting. You know, in the past, we've been clear. We're fighting a nation, a people, an ideology. Now we're fighting a tactic. And we've engaged at the tactical level and kind of held it there. We measure success by numbers of people we kill. I've seen that movie. I've been in that movie. It was called Vietnam, where we counted up the bodies. And so as an organization, we're probably doing well tactically against al-Qaeda. We're cutting finances off. We're breaking down cells. But at a strategic level, at an operational level, are we really having that effect? Is al-Qaeda actually stronger as an ideology, even if it's weakened as an organization? And I asked those military leaders that were around that table to take a step back and do what they normally do. Think about a military problem in a strategic, operational, and tactical sense, the three levels that we deal with. And I said, strategically, if you were Osama bin Laden, what is your center of gravity, your source of strength? What is important to you? I cheated a little bit because I actually gave this problem to my students at William & Mary where I teach. They were quick to come up with the solution. I wanted to see if the generals could be as fast as my students. And they thought long and hard, and they didn't come up with as good as answers as my students did. My students said Osama bin Laden's center of gravity, after they debated this for a little bit, is the need to have angry young men, a constant flow of angry young men, willing to blow themselves up. And so I asked them, well, then what's important to him? They said, to make sure the anger stays in place. And the anger is there to generate that continuous pool. What causes the anger? They decided political, economic, social, oppression, repression, sense of injustice. As long as that's fomenting in the region, he has this continuous flow. So I said, okay, let's take it down a notch. Let's say that's important to him strategically. He needs to maintain that flow. What operationally does he need at that level? They decided, my students, that he needs that aberrant form of Islam, that radicalized form of religion that provides the rationale and justification for what they do. So as long as that's not countered, as long as there isn't any voice that speaks out in any major way against it, he has the pieces. He has, at a strategic level, that flow of angry young men willing to kill themselves. He has the rationale that he can give them to justify what they do. And he has the tactics in terms of terrorist activity and the things that he does that works well against our conventional superiority. Now, whether you agree with that structure or not, you may in your own mind say, I would choose a different center of gravity at each of the levels. It is a way of thinking that I don't think we've applied here. The point is not whether those are the right centers of gravity. The point is whether we're thinking about this strategically. Are we trying to deal with the issues of anger to stop that flow at that strategic level? Are we trying to counter the rationale that he provides that justifies what they do? And when I say we, it's not just the United States. It's the leadership in the region and those in the region that are suffering from this as well as others in the world. But I think one of the problems with the war on terrorism is this need to think more broadly and strategically, to understand it's not only about fighting at a tactical level. It's not only about law enforcement cooperation. It's not only about drying up the financial resources. It is more about changing the conditions that feed the more important levels for Osama bin Laden, the Al-Qaeda, and the other extremist groups. The third issue in this part of the world that I think is important is the issue of reform, political, economic, social reform. It's happening agonizingly slowly. There are places out there and leaders out there where they're beginning to experiment with change, where you're beginning to see some sort of democratization, some forms, some organizations put in place, where you're beginning to see women's rights and other things beginning to be dealt with and come up as issues that they're debating openly. The reform needs to move faster. The reform and where it is moving in a positive light needs to be acknowledged by us. I see very little written, very little credit given to places where they're attempting to do this. There are places where the people are talking about it, the leadership has been reluctant to move. I think in some way there needs to be a cooperative movement to encourage it, provide the incentives, and in some cases the pressures to move forward. It can't be sort of haphazard throughout the region like it is now. And reform is going to be one of the keys that cuts that anger off. And where it is being done, in some of the Gulf states and crucial states, where they are beginning to step forward and try this out, that's where the acknowledgement, the help, and the incentives ought to be provided to help them through this, or to encourage it, or to allow them to develop it. I see very little acknowledgement of it and where it's happening in the world. The fourth thing I would mention is something that I've been pressuring leaders in this region to do. And in the last year, I've been in a flurry of conferences and communications, emails, phone calls about this. But only now am I beginning to see it happen. And that's the need for an open Islamic dialogue, where moderate Islamic scholars and others are given the venues, the fora, to speak, to start to challenge extremism, to start to challenge their own religious beliefs, to start to challenge what Islam is, to start to challenge what is right and wrong in the religion, to start to challenge and discuss how the religion needs to deal with modernity in the 21st century. And actually, friends of mine in the region are now starting to send me a steady stream of emails with op-ed pieces written by not only religious leaders, but others that are now gaining the courage to step forward and begin to speak and engage in this conversation. For those of you that may be Muslim or understand Islam, you know that this is a religion that enjoys debate, oftentimes in very detailed points of theology and doctrine. It is not unusual in this religion to have these debates. It's going to be tricky and takes a lot of courage to get into some of these kinds of issues because of the nature of the issues. But it needs to happen. The beheadings in Iraq and the attack in Beslan of the school seemed to generate a flurry of these. My worry was, and still is, that it might just be a moment and then it will recede. And I've written to a number of friends out there who have the power of the press or the leadership in the countries to encourage it, to continue it, to make that dialogue and that debate part of the everyday dialogue that this religion needs to go through. Without that identification, without that challenge, I think they're in trouble. They're going to cede this great religion to extremists by their silence. The fifth part, or the fifth issue, I think is how we deal with Iran. in this part of the world, especially in the Middle East, especially in the Persian Gulf, if you were to ask who the enemy really is, they would point across the strait to Iran. They won't say that publicly. That's very difficult. But it's been a long-standing concern about the rise of Persian hegemony in the region. And they're going to look at how we handle it. It's tricky right now. Iraq has really given the hardliners a moment to step all over the reformers again. And the reformers, prior to Iraq, that I thought were making real headway and about maybe to bring this whole thing to a head, have now been forced to step back. Iran will probably develop some capability to weaponize a weapon of mass destruction, probably in its Shahab series of missiles. So Iran will present a problem in the region and scare others. They will look at how we deal with Iran. We've been schizophrenic on the issue, whether we deal with the leadership or not, whether we isolate it or not, whether we support the European Union and their efforts or not. We need to have a clear policy toward Iran. And it cannot be one that rewards the hardliners in any way, because it is the one nation I had the most hope for out there that would rise up and change from within. Because the younger generation there does not want to be taken back to the 7th century. And they are the ones that will be the core of the reform movement in Iran, if given organization, resources, and leadership. In the one case where exiles could count, exiles in positions of leadership, we didn't support them. Where they didn't count in Iraq, we did. We got the right strategy, put it in the wrong place. And Iran is going to be also important because it is going to be contrasted with Libya and how we handle Libya. We have one nation there, whether you like Muammar or not, who decided to divest himself of weapons of mass destruction and basically throw himself on the mercy of the West and say, I'm cooperating, and one nation that is defying us. And those two will stand in contrast as to how we deal with them and how we handle them. And we've got to remember that sort of connection, because that's going to be a view from out there. Sixth is Iraq. We're in a mess. It's headed toward looking like Lebanon, only larger and worse. Every time I try to find something optimistic, something to look forward to, some hope, I start running out of opportunities. Moments come when the statue comes down, you capture Saddam and others, and we seem not only to be able to not be able to capitalize on those moments, we seem to make a series of bad decisions to ensure we go south on those moments. The next moment is the election, January 30th. And if the elections are reasonably effective, I have a small bit of hope for Iraq. Underlying all that is a hope that the resilience of the Iraqi people and what they've been through is strong enough to carry them through. We have certainly not done anything to help this country along. And I think it goes back to a point of why we took down Saddam and why they wanted Saddam gone. Because that end state, getting rid of Saddam, was the same, but the reasons were different. And therein lies the problem. We wanted Saddam gone because of the potential of weapons of mass destruction and the potential or actual association with terrorism. The people of Iraq wanted him gone because they wanted a better security situation, they wanted a better life, and they wanted some say in how they were governed. We met our objectives, and we have not met their objectives. That's why we're parting company out there from the beginning. And until their wishes are fulfilled, their desires, their reason for seeing Saddam gone, we're not going to move forward. Security forces being created without a state. That's our focus. Create an army, create a police force. Yet there's no state. I have a little difficulty understanding that. Who do I swear allegiance to? There's no constitution. Do I swear allegiance to the interim leader of Iraq? Is that what I die for? We're creating security forces before we've created hope, before we've created the state, before we've created some sort of economic development, jobs and security. And that becomes a problem. It is sort of a reverse process, and we find ourselves stuck in that. The seventh point, a number of separatist movements around this part of the world. I just came back last week from Mindanao, and met with some members of the Moral Islamic Liberation Front. Last year I was involved in Indonesia with the Free Aceh movement in Sumatra. And I'm doing several other mediations or negotiations or facilitations in that part of the world. And what strikes me and what gets little attention is there are a number of movements that happen to be Islamic, but they aren't radicalized Islamic movements, that opportunities are there to settle these issues. The governments in these cases may be willing to attempt settlement, but the time has come to do it now, or else we're going to lose them to the extremists. Because the extremists, the Al-Qaedas, the Jamal Ismailia, and the others are trying to radicalize them and win them over. And in some cases, elements within them have already gone over out of frustration. And so part of this war on terrorism has to include how we handle Islamic movements, separatist movements, because that's going to be an encouragement and a demonstration that we are interested in their complaints about how they're ruled, about a fair shake in terms of the economic system. And in each of these cases, it seems to me the need is easily identifiable. The need and the request from them is better education, economic development, and some sort of capacity building within their communities, the ability to govern, the ability to provide rule of law. And I've seen it even at a very small scale, that our USAID projects and others go a long way in helping this. We need to do more in terms of prevention, more upfront work in creating stability. We seem to be geared to enter a crisis, to respond to the crisis, then go through sort of some agonizing process to decide whether we're going to recover it, reconstruct it, or transform it. We've never been very good at investments up front to prevent this. As the commander of U.S. Central Command, the commanders in my time of the Unified Commands were tasked by the last administration to shape the environment. We were told to go out there and engage in cooperation with our brothers at State Department, those in the other agencies of government on the ground. We were trying to prevent destabilizing factors from rising up and erupting into crisis. But the frustration was not enough resources, no coherent policy or strategy in doing with this. In this part of the world and in other parts of the world where we have movements like this that again provide that cannon fodder for the Al-Qaedas and the JIs, we need to start investing up front, working with the governments, providing the incentives to move them away from that, or else we're going to lose them and we add to Osama bin Laden's cannon fodder. We're going to also have to deal in the eighth issue with failed or incapable states in this part of the world. We saw what happened in Afghanistan when we walked away after the Soviet dominance was removed, and we allowed it to sink into the control of the Taliban and the warlords. The Somalias, the Sudans, many parts of this world that we would normally say, who cares and how does it affect us? We now have a clear indication that they can become sanctuaries or pits that provide that kind of refuge for the extremists and allow them to work their magic, to build their madrasas that teach the hate and evil, to allow them the base camps and the training areas, and to allow them a free ride. In my time at Central Command, one of the things we pushed for is to try to bring the fight to Osama bin Laden by looking at frontline states, Central Asia and other places, Yemen, many of the ambassadors that served out there are in the front row, and tried to say, let's invest in them. Let's help them counter this movement. Let's let Osama bin Laden and the extremists worry about their own backyard instead of giving them a free ride there. We didn't, and we paid a price, and we paid a price on 9/11, of course. The ninth issue will be our future relations. Everybody in this region says, where do we go from here? Everybody asks me, now we've got our street hating your street hating our street. Where do we go from here? Everything has been broken now. What will our relationships be in this part of the world? We're headed toward an adversarial relationship just because our peoples, our culture, our communications are headed in that direction. Our mad mullahs talk to their mad mullahs, and those are the only voices we're hearing. And there's an extreme amount of angst out in this part of the world about the future. The most important part of this relationship which is the 10th issue, is the future security arrangement. This is a part of the world where somebody else has basically, in the last century or more, dictated the security arrangement. If the Brits didn't do it in the Gulf, we did it. We had the two pillars strategy, or we had the Carter Doctrine, or we had the Gulf Coalition, or we had the dual containment policy. And they were fitted around it. They're now unsure. It's all been broken. The model used after the Cold War to gain a UN resolution, to build a coalition under that, to operate within the limits of the UN resolution and do it in a cooperative way, held together. It wasn't a NATO, it wasn't a formal alliance. It didn't have the power of the treaty arrangements we had in the Far East, but it was an informal agreement, and it worked. They sought a much more formalization of that agreement. And now the question out there is, what do we do about our security? Are you going to leave it to us? And we're not quite capable of collective security. We need the underpinning and the base of the United States or someone else to help us. Maybe the arrangement is wrong. Maybe we will not come back to you having a large troop presence, but you will support our own collective security arrangement in some way. You will allow us to work with each other. In the past, we've done this through a series of bilateral organizations, and we were the glue that brought it together. We've now pulled the glue out, and there are a lot of friction points between them. They're not at a stage when they can come together. They're where Europe was in the interwar periods, or maybe even before. And they're going to need that kind of relationship built and that kind of security arrangement to help us through this. When I was the SINC at CENTCOM, I was told that there were three reasons why we cared about this region. One was the continuous flow of energy from this region, because 70% of the world's oil, 50% of the world's liquefied natural gas rested in CENTCOM's area responsibility. I was told that access to this region was important too, and freedom of navigation, because the major trade routes of the world, east-west, west-east, go through Suez Canal, Bab el-Mandeb, Strait of Hormuz, the Malaccan Straits, and it's important to keep that open and keep our access. I was told that our allies were important to us in this part of the world too. I came to another decision too. The people in this part of the world are important. There is nothing remarkably different about them. Their values are not very different than ours. A good friend of mine, James Zogby, took a poll in the Arab world as to what their values or concerns are. And he had them in priority, 1 to 10. What struck Jim when he took the poll at the behest of Crown Prince Abdullah of Saudi Arabia is how remarkably they look like what Americans would list and in the same priority. So Jim came back and took a poll here. I give this poll to my students because remarkably, not only are the values and the concerns the same, they virtually match up in priority. And so the problem is not one inherent in a culture or inherent in terms of what the values or concerns are. They are more in our inability to communicate, to interrelate, to understand each other, to build a common ground, to have patience, and to help this part of the world come into the 21st century, which it's going to do in fits and starts. And it's going to be a difficult path. But I think we will be judged by history as to what our contribution is to this evolution for this part of the world. And they will be judged by how much they stand up to the challenge, especially the moderate leadership in this part of the world. And that'll be the first part of this century's, I think, principal task for this planet in moving over 1 billion people into the 21st century and into sort of a communion of nations that works. It's going to be a difficult job. It is not going to be easy. It is going to take the commitment and risk of us and many others around the world. It's going to take cooperation and strategic thinking. It's going to take the commitment of resources. And if we're wise, the resources can be invested instead of thrown down into a pit after the crisis has erupted. The 10 issues I've described, and you could probably add several others if you think about it, are going to be the core issues that we are going to have to deal with. And I think principally what we need to do is, with the leadership in this part of the world and the leadership in the rest of the world, is to step back and think through the best strategic approach and the best policies for handling these, understanding, again, that they are all connected. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be glad to take any questions you have.
Great. Well, we certainly have had a tour of a grand horizon here. The ground rules are line up at the microphones on the ground floor and at the first risers, and introduce yourself and put your question briefly. No speeches, and we'll start with this lady, please.
Hello, my name is Masuda Sultan. I'm a student here. You talked about angry Muslim men, essentially. I'm from Afghanistan, and I've had some direct experience with civilian casualties, and I've met a lot of men who are angry about that, who ordinarily consider the United States their friends. I wanted to know, I wanted to get a little bit of insight into how the military thinks about civilian casualties. You know, we understand that they're not counted, families aren't apologized to, assistance generally isn't given in a sort of, there's no policy towards it, although commanders do hand out money sometimes and help out. So how does the military think about it? And also, strategically, from a national security standpoint, how do you feel about it?
Well, first of all, I have to say that we, as a nation, the United States, I would argue, take civilian casualties or any damage that is done outside of the forces that are engaged not only extremely seriously, it comes into our planning and actually restricts us in many ways, and actually in many cases could put our own troops in harm's way. History is replete with examples, everything from Monte Cassino to elsewhere. I had this very same question by Al Jazeera when they interviewed me when I was the commander-in-chief at CENTCOM. They phrased it a little bit differently. They asked me, what kind of in your structure, what kind of formal consideration is given about the possibility of civilian casualties or damaging things that are outside the military realm that should be respected, religious or historic items? It is built into our system. We have a core of staff judge advocates that look at everything we do, every element of maneuver, every target list, everything we fire on, and an assessment is made about the potential for this. We have put in front of us when we're going through places like Fallujah or other places, restricted target areas, areas that we cannot enter, cannot fire into. We make agonizing decisions about the potential for civilian casualties. We get caught up often in a situation because the potential enemy out there knows that this is the way we act, that they use these facilities. I just saw a report from the Marine units in Fallujah. Out of 100-plus mosques in Fallujah, 60 were used as firing positions and as weapon storage areas by the insurgents in Fallujah. It is difficult. We've been accused in Vietnam of over-focusing on body count. Our military has sort of an adversarial reaction to counting bodies. There was a tendency sometime to decide those bodies were enemy. It became extremely difficult and controversial. When I was in Vietnam, I've attacked enemy positions where we found the bodies of women and children with weapons, where we have had kids throw grenades at us. When I was in Somalia, we had the same thing happen to us, where women and children were used as combatants or to move equipment. And this has a tremendous debilitating effect on our military when that happens. But I can tell you that I have never seen a military as concerned about that as ours. I can tell you that that's one of the awful things about war. I can tell you that never do we deliberately do that. I was accused by Richard Clark of not firing a mission to get Osama bin Laden because I was worried about collateral damage, civilian casualties. And he was right. When I was the commander-in-chief of U.S. Central Command, we had some intelligence where Osama bin Laden might have been in a house in Kandahar. Our assessment in that target list, that we fired it, is that we could have killed 1,500 to 2,000 innocents. I refused to fire the mission. The President of the United States agreed with me. Clark called me a criminal. but I wouldn't shoot it. You know, so if you want to know, do we care? We do. Do we sometimes put ourselves at risk to avoid that? Yes. I have personally experienced times when I know our troops have paid with their lives or wounds because we didn't just wantonly engage civilian targets. There will always be civilian casualties in the battlefield. A strange sort of irony has occurred with our greater precision in weapons and our greater ability to pinpoint targets. We have lessened the percentage of combatant casualties, and we have actually ended up now where wars take a greater percentage toll on civilians. Now, there are other things going on with the U.S. military to help prevent this. Let me give you an example. Obviously, through the Ottawa Convention, mines have been banned by many countries. Our country has banned landmines that you plant and forget. We have restricted ourselves to only self-destruct mines. So you shoot them, they're only armed for a given period of time, then they self-destruct. We are working to try to get even beyond that capability. We are investing a lot in non-lethal technology where you can, you know, this is Buck Rogerish, but some of it is actually feasible, where you could set up force fields where you can't enter because for a human being, they set off your equilibrium, or for even vehicles, they stall you. But they don't create any kind of permanent or anything more than temporary nauseous or effect like that. And our military is willing to invest in that to try to prevent those sorts of things. It doesn't mean there isn't going to be civilian casualties, but I can tell you that the regret in every attempt is made not to have them happen.
Can you speak a little bit about what happens when there are civilian casualties and how the Muslim world reacts to them, and how that angers people, and what a national security threat that is to us Americans here in the United States?
Well, sure it is, because I tell my students, I want you to, when the Iraq War was going on, I asked my students to look at the war from three perspectives. I told them to read the Washington Post, New York Times, watch CNN, Fox, and all that, but to also listen to BBC broadcasts, read the Financial Times, or read The Economist. And I told them to go online and pull down Arabic, English language newspapers and online news services and look at the three perspectives on the war. Your point that you don't hear much about civilian casualties here, you don't hear much about military casualties maybe from Al Jazeera, and more focused on potential civilian casualties. The identity of who's dead there, where someone says, let's say the United States military says that was an insurgent house, and where, say, Al Jazeera says, no, that was an innocent group of people. Oftentimes, how are you going to sort it out? For us to convince someone, we may have to reveal classified sources as to how we got that target, which may be very solid. I can't go into that, but we know it is. But we can't defend it publicly, or we release our ability publicly as to how we gain that information. And so what is truth in all that? There's a different perspective in what you see. Unfortunately, what you see are dead bodies. Was that body an insurgent? Was it an innocent? And the perspectives you have. And I don't think we're ever going to be able to sort through all that. I mean, the only assurance I can give you, every military organization I've been associated, part of, commanded, is that became an integral part of how we planned what we did. And we oftentimes had our own troops at risk as a result of that.
We've got a lot of questions, and each one of these we could drill down quite deeply, but I'm going to say one question a customer, and let's try to have shorter questions and maybe even shorter answers. But it's a good answer, because that's a whole topic in itself. This lady.
Hi, my name is Mary Barish, and I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School. This isn't the case in the U.S., but in the Middle East, I think it's widely accepted that part of the reason, at least part of the reason, that Arafat didn't sign Barak's offer was because he wasn't able to sell it to his people. And I think another realization that people came to was that that's also probably going to be the most generous offer that the Palestinians will see, at least in the foreseeable future. So how do you think that a future leader such as Abu Mazen would have, who has even less legitimacy than Arafat amongst the Palestinians, will be able to sell an even less generous offer than Arafat, who wasn't able to sell?
Well, I found something interesting in the proposal that Yossi Beilin and Yasser Rabo made, the Geneva Accord, where those are basically the two leaders of peace movements on either side, Israeli and Palestinian. And basically the Geneva Accord was along the lines of what was put on the table at Camp David and going back to Oslo. But they added a twist to it that was never really followed on. They said, here is the proposal, here is the offer, here is the arrangement, but now let's go survey the Israeli people and the Palestinian people. Let's do a survey. What was interesting is the most vehement objection about all that came from the leadership of both the Israelis and Palestinians against that, did not want that survey. So I would put it to you this way, because I agree with the premise. It's not going to be acceptable unless the people accept it and agree to it and understand it. And I think that ultimately, whatever happens, whatever plan or whatever proposal is put on the table, that's going to have to come into play. It's either going to have to be accepted or it's going to have to be proven over time. It may be that there has to be things offered that are going to have to be wait and see and let me see if you deliver this. If the agreement, and I go back to my point about Gaza now being an opportunity, where maybe some of the incentives provided might be investment, might be improving the security situation, might be improving the economic development. And it might be that the people are willing to accept conditionally to see how it unfolds and then be willing to do it on a larger scale. I agree with you. Whether it's Abu Mazen or it's Ariel Sharon or anybody else, they aren't going to be able to take a deal that the majority of people don't accept. Now, having said that, they will never convince 100% of their own populations. There are going to be elements, I had to deal with those elements that I was there, that are not going to accept any proposal, that are at the extreme. But again, that's part of political leadership, is when you feel the deal is right, is can you convince your people, and can you implement it on the ground? I would argue, from my own point of view, that there was other motivations for Yasser Arafat not accepting it. I think it more had to do with his own legacy as opposed to the willingness to compromise that maybe made it more difficult for him.
Hi. My name is Rebecca, and I'm an undergraduate. I wanted to ask you, in light of the fact that many of the worst regimes and governments that we've been discussing tonight are bankrolled by American dependence on their oil, how do you see the potentially transformative power of American energy independence?
Well, obviously, that's one solution, is independence from reliance on oil, natural gas. I'm not an expert on energy. Somebody told me that even if we discovered a viable alternative, it would take 50 years to actually put it into play and make it viable. Others have argued it can be done in less time. But at least even if we had a commitment and the technology was there, we are some decades dependent on it. It's a fact of life. As a matter of fact, the demand is going to rise. We could not, even if we drilled in Anwar and throughout the Gulf of Mexico, I understand, produce more than about 3% of the world's oil, and we consume about 25%. Our reliance on Middle East oil is not as great as other parts of the world. I think, and again, I don't want to get my statistics wrong, but I think we maybe import about 20% from there, or maybe even less, whereas Western Europe, Japan, and now China, which has become an ever-growing consumer, has even a larger and growing demand in this part of the world. So it isn't just a United States requirement and dependence. It is a global dependence. And, of course, because of the way economies work today, even if we were able to become independent from it, but somebody else's economy crashed, we would feel the effects from that too. So at least in the short term, decades ahead, that reliance is going to be there. I think that we are probably at a point now, though, that these regimes that maybe got a free ride because of that are under pressure from within. That's an effect of this extremist movement. I want to go back to my point about reform now. Many people I meet in this part of the world who I never thought I would hear talk about reform, very senior leaders, politically and military, are now talking about it. Whether it's out of necessity, fear, or actually enlightenment, who knows? And maybe it's a combination of all. But I think there is a moment now to help generate, promote, provide the incentives for that reform. But I'm not sure what you're getting at in terms of the oil dependence. if we do create an alternative source, it isn't going to be a short-term solution and probably not meet the need and the crush we're getting because of the urgency of the extremist movements in the region. Now, that may be more of an incentive than we're going to provide in the short term.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Alexander Slater, and I'm a first year at the law school. And I guess it's sort of two short questions on my part, but probably longer from you. One is, given what's happened with American policy towards Iran, what do we do now? And the second one is, do you see Syrian troops pulling out of Lebanon in the near future?
Well, on the second one first, I don't see it. I mean, obviously that would be desirable, but I think that that isn't in the cards in the short term. I think that the issue with Syria is going to come to a head here on what's coming out of what we've discovered in Fallujah and other areas about Syrian involvement with the insurgents, or at least Syria being used as kind of a base of operations with the insurgents. I think that there's going to be issues that are going to come to a head between us and Syria, and that could escalate if Syria doesn't do anything about it. I would worry that that's going to escalate to us having to take military action, not in the sense we're attacking Syria or anything, but that we might be forced into cross-border operations or something like that to prevent that flow of insurgents. We have not done a good job in sealing the borders, which had to be one of the requirements of going into Iraq. And we've allowed them to establish, in the vernacular of old hands like myself, a Ho Chi Minh Trail, that hasn't been interdicted. On Iran, I think one thing that we have to understand about weapons of mass destruction possessed by a nation state, what does it get them? Because they have now put themselves in a position where they've alienated the world. They're seen clearly as a threat. They expose themselves to sanctions and pressures. They can see the model with North Korea. They really can't use them. I mean, how can they use them? If they use them, they would end up causing their own destruction. They don't have them in sufficient numbers. This isn't the Soviet Union or the West versus the East in the standoff. And even at that, the counter-value targeting and everything else that went into that made it not feasible even during the Cold War. So I'm not sure what weapons of mass destruction in the possession of a nation state that has something to lose and has a few of them really gets them in the end. It's more, I think, a mental belief that it gives them prestige and power and allows them to exert some sort of hegemonic designs on a region. I think as long as we're there and involved in the security and provide that umbrella of protection, it isn't going to be that threatening to those in the region. And it could only be used as a last desperate act. I think you have to manage any kind of containment or sanctions in a way that there isn't that last desperate act. That's what I would worry about in the case of North Korea or others. I do not think we should engage the hardliners in Iran. I do not think we should encourage them. I do not think we should accept them. They have not disavowed the objectives of the revolution, which is to spread the extremist views and acts around the region of the world. And their MOIS and intelligence service still supports terrorism. And they have been involved in terrorist acts against us and others in the region in the past. And if they haven't moved past that, again, I don't think we should deal with them or treat them in a way any differently. Again, I want to go back to my point I made earlier. That part of the world is going to look at Libya as compared to Iran. If we reward and acknowledge Iran because they possess weapons of mass destruction, we're in effect saying the course that Libya took didn't gain them anything. And I think that's important to keep that in balance, because everybody that has designs on maybe gaining weapons of mass destruction or might go down that course is going to look at those two models to see what it comes out, how they come out in the end.
Thank you. Dr. Mustafa Kibaroğlu. I'm an academic from Turkey and a fellow here, International Security Program, managing the Adam Project. I have a question on Iran, but let me first of all tell that you were a role model for lecturers. And I hope this transcript of this lecture can be made into a book and taught in a leadership classes. I would like you to elaborate on Iran a little bit more precisely. I'm studying Iran for 10 years. What I said in my publication 10 years ago now came out to be true these days. I think Iran has two windows of opportunities. One is to quit. The other one is to pass the threshold, which I believe they are very close. If you were still the commander-in-chief of U.S. Central Command and you were given a task of drafting some sort of a strategy for a limited military strike, what would be your priorities and what kind of role would you cast for Turkey, if at all, in that respect? Thank you.
Well, first of all, Turkey has been a critical ally for us. If you go back to the first Gulf War, I think what made the military piece of that go so smoothly is that we were allowed to use Turkish bases and the Turkish commitment for us to be able to not only handle that, but the aftermath and the results with the Kurdish population that was attacked too. Turkey being part of NATO has always been encouraging because it is the only Islamic nation in NATO, and it demonstrated our ability to cooperate, fight side by side, have a partner, and we have fought side by side in places like Somalia and elsewhere with the Turks. So Turkey has always been key, although not in, say, CENTCOM's area of responsibility, because it is a Muslim nation. It was a demonstration of a secular nation, one that is in an alliance with us, and one that we have everywhere from Korea and the Korean War to Somalia. We've been side by side, soldier to soldier, and that becomes important. To go on to your point about Iran, you know, I would have told you before our Iraq incursion that Iran was moving toward change from within, definitely, and probably on the fast track. The reformers I talked to inside of Iran and outside, when I would say to them, why isn't the reform movement moving more quickly or is more active, they would tell me that they did not want a second revolution. They did not want blood in the streets again. But they did want change. And they wanted change to come from within the constitutional structure, if not there, then through passive resistance, civil disobedience, demonstrations, but to force the change in a nonviolent way. And I think increasingly they were gaining power. Now, the hardliners were very shrewd in the way they allowed that sort of steam pressure to be released. They would give in to certain demands. There was more freedom of the press, more academic freedom. At the local level, some elections, they allowed their candidates to oust the clerics and put in place. But they held on to the center of power. The Ayatollahs obviously held on to the military piece, weapons of mass destruction program, intelligence services, and all that. I think Iraq set the reform movement back. In addition to that, when the reform movement was the most energized, there was an opportunity to help it from outside, to organize exile leaders that had a voice and credibility in there, to provide resources, to provide information, to help provide organization. That's what was the cry from within there. And I think we missed an opportunity to do that. The reform movement is generational in Iran, in my mind. It is the young people who are not going to be moved back to the 7th century and want change. And again, I think the movement has been set back for many reasons with the involvement in Iraq, and the hardliners have gained a more significant advantage as a result. But I think we need to think through about re-engaging in that and supporting the reformers. What will not work in this part of the world is an outside intervention to make change, as well as an important as an inside change that comes from inside the nation itself and rejects this extremism or this fundamentalist movement. Iran is the best hope. In a strange way, it is the greatest threat and it is the greatest hope for internal change, which could set the model for the region, in my mind. Given the direction it's going now, in our views, we are going to be put in a position of containment there unless the EU is able to work some arrangement on these weapons of mass destruction, in my view.
Thank you.
Given the time, what we're going to try to do is take the three people that are at the microphone, put your questions very briefly, and then we'll let General Zinni sum up and answer all three of them.
Hi, my name is Robert Berman. I'm a mid-career MPA. I'd like to follow up on the questions that were raised because it's really not clear to me what your position is concerning vis-a-vis Iran. Given that all diplomatic efforts and other efforts by different countries in the West have failed to convince Iran not to go nuclear, given that the reformist movements, as you have said, have been set back and are not taking over the country anytime soon, And given that, by all accounts, Iran is very, very close on going nuclear, is it your position that the United States should not take any military action to take out nuclear targets in Iran? Or should, because it seemed to me from one of your responses to someone else, was that we should just kind of assume that they're going to act rationally and it's not in their best interest, and therefore you kind of imply we should just let them go nuclear and hope for the best.
Well, let me give you... Let's
get the three out, please. This one. Yep.
Hi.
The pressure's on me to remember these questions now.
I'll remember. Okay.
My name's Kareem. I'm a resident of Cambridge, and I just had a question on your top 10 list for Middle East unrest, and I was just wondering whether you really expect the Palestinian people, with their history of determined resistance, to accept the continuing racist apartheid state-sponsored terrorism that Israel applies against them.
Hi, I'm Jackie Newmeyer. I'm a fellow in national security here at Harvard. And I was wondering whether you think it's time for the U.S. to invest more in a constabulary force, and to the extent that we've had some small successes on the ground in Iraq, to what skills or abilities you attribute those successes in the troops?
I would opt for containment, because to go to your first suggestion about a selective or surgical strike, you're betting that there's no reaction to that missiles don't pour down on our forces, our interests, our allies in the region, that small patrol boats don't come out into the Gulf, hard to pick up on radar with cruise missiles, that they're highly mobile cruise missiles won't be fired at our ships and positions in there, that they won't, through their dhows and submarines, come out into the strait and mine it, which would be very difficult for us to clear. That would all generate, as a result of the first strike, if they had that kind of reaction, us then having to go into Iran. And if you liked Iraq, you'll love Iran, and we aren't going to do that one on the cheap, believe me. And so I would opt for containment. I would opt for sanctions and containment, isolation, much like we do with North Korea. I think that a surgical strike has to be one, if it is done, that we have some sort of understanding and assurance that that isn't going to lead to a reaction that will eventually compel us to have to go in with ground forces and in force to take down the regime, which would be very, very difficult. Second point on the Palestinian question, look, I probably have somebody else in this audience who will stand up and give me the opposite version. When I was involved in this process, I had both sides attempting to, quote, win me over. I had the Prime Minister, Sharon, saying, whose side are you on? How do you weigh the situation? On the other side, the same arguments. And I said, if I start making moral judgments and taking positions, then I might as well go home. I'm not a mediator. I've taken a position or side. There's enough wrong on both sides. There's enough right on both sides. My position out there was, look at your children. You can go back and look at all the injustices were done. We could try to rewrite history. We could try to decide who crapped on what rock 3,000 years ago and never figure it out and not go forward. Look at your kids. Go down the seeds of peace. Watch those Israeli and Palestinian kids who don't come from families that are peaceniks. In many cases, to my surprise, they came from families that didn't want to be there, that had a lot of hate for the other side. But those kids had the guts to say, I want to see for myself. And what they said to me is, if we can figure it out, General, why the hell can't you figure it out, and the adults in this process? Now, we can argue about who's right or wrong and who inflicted what horrific act on the other, and we can probably debate that all day. My focus is, you're going to have to put the past behind you, and you're going to have to decide what kind of future you want for your children. If you want them to live under that and you want them to continue the debate, Shimon Peres told me when I got there, you'll meet three kinds of people in this business. You'll meet those that will want to go back and relive history. You're going to meet the righteous. The righteous will throw Bibles and Qurans at you, and there is no compromise. He said the second group you will meet is what he called the collectors of arguments. They're the talking heads you see on TV. They want to debate the issues, make the cases. He said ignore both of them. The third group you're going to meet, and I did meet them, are those kids and those families that just begged me and pulled on my jacket, Israelis and Palestinians, says, help us through this. Let us find a way to live in peace with each other. So my answer to you is not to take a position or side or make a judgment or a moral equivalence or anything else, but I'm willing to help them get through it if they give a damn about their kids. Okay? The talk in Washington now, as a matter of fact, I spent all day yesterday on this, is how do we do reconstruction better? We don't, as I said in my talk, we don't do investment up front to prevent destabilizing events and areas to erupt into crisis. We need to do more of that. We need to build capacity, help with education programs, economic development. Certainly once a crisis happens, we are great at military intervention, and we're great at sticking the military with that. When we were in Somalia, I was the police chief for Mogadishu. I was on the political committee, the judicial committee. Nothing I was trained for to handle that. That's because we did not have a counterpart deployable capability that dealt with the political, economic, social, humanitarian issues that was as robust, as well supported, with the resources and the talents that handled those dimensions. We are great at one-punch fighting, military force. We are not so great at putting on the ground those other necessary parts, the political reconstruction, economic, social, humanitarian, and all those pieces. It's a pickup team. Look at the CPA in Iraq. Scraped together the last minute. No planning. Bad decisions. Did not understand the environment. Did not understand what they were getting into. Did not bring in the people with the best talent or the numbers they needed. Were not organized in the right way to deal with it. And that, I think, has hit home in our nation's capital. Right now, the State Department has formed an office, and they've gotten some meager resources. They need more for stability and reconstruction. And they put some good people in there to start working on what is needed. And I think we need two things. 9/11 Commission has hit it on the head regarding intelligence, integrated planning, integrated monitoring of the situation, integrated recommendations, get rid of the stovepipes. But that's only intelligence. We need to do it in planning. We need to do it in operations and logistics. And when we put somebody out there for whatever reason, they just can't only have uniforms. We need some suits. And we need some Save the Whales T-shirts out there, too, working the humanitarian issues. People that have worked together, exercised together, planned together, trained together. Because in most of these, the military piece is not the most important. It may be the most pressing and the emergency need. But eventually, how you rebuild that society is going to be the key as to whether it doesn't come back and fall into the same problems we've had before. And then again, fall to the military to try to resolve way beyond its scope and its skills. Okay, thank you.
With apologies to 20 more questions that are up, unfortunately our work rules say that General Zinni has completed this part of the Lamont lecture. Let me ask you again to join me in thanking him for coming and giving us such a broad overview and telling him we would love to have him come back.